Hello and welcome to another edition of the Tigers Down Under. It's our winter deadline day special, and it's your host as always, Alex, and joined by Logan.
Yeah, good evening, Alex, and good evening, all of the Hull supporters out there.
It's been a bit of a quieter window than we're used to. This time last year, we just signed, I think it was 7 players under Silver, a number of them on loan, but there was a lot of new faces coming in, a couple of faces going out to kind of get our head around. Uh, a bit quieter this time around, but we've got a few players who did finally sign on deadline day, and also some near misses where we almost sold a couple of players. Touched on that in our last episode. We'll go into a lot more detail this time around. I'll start with like an overall view of the transfer window, Logan. How did you see it? It took us a while to get our business done, but we did get some business done right at the end. Do you think it was enough? Do you think it was in the right places? How did you see it?
I think the transfer window as a whole was pretty dull and underwhelming, particularly for City fans. We've become kind of adapted to the 24-hour deadline day, offering quite a large spectacle with multiple signings on the most recent transfer windows that we've had, and we kind of expected that, especially with the dip in form and the position we find the club in. It was kind of hopeful, I guess is the word that you would use. The city folk were hoping that the Allams would, for once, offer some kind of reprieve with the kind of dour situation and invest in the right ways. And I just don't think that overall we've got all that much to be excited about. With that being said, it would be very rude of us to kind of count out MacDonald as a quality signing. And I thought that, to be fair, on the weekend he had not the worst of games, and I think that what we kind of hoped for and what we got were two totally different things.
Well, you've touched on McDonald there, so we'll launch into a discussion about him first of all, and then we'll touch on Harry Wilson as well, who's just come in from Liverpool. But Angus McDonald signed him permanent deal from Barnsley. I always get a bit excited when it's a permanent deal because it's a bit of a depressing state of affairs at the moment. But every summer it seems like there's a new group of players out of contract leaving the club. So signing players on permanent deals kind of lets me think, okay, well at least there'll be some bodies at the club next year. So that's always a bit exciting. While we were chasing him, there was all that talk that he had the issues with his iron levels, wasn't able to play, was getting regular injections. There was a bit of concern that we were signing him not quite, match fit, ready to go. But yeah, he was thrown into the action at Preston, and as you say, uh, tra- you looked quite good and accounted for himself quite well. Um, Barnsley club captain, was with them for a couple of years, signed from non-league Torquay, started his career at Reading as well. Um, Good sort of figure to bring into the club. We always sort of say we need more of these sorts of leaders and generals and people that will sort of pull the squad together and really get people going and get everyone pulling in the right direction. So good to sign a player with that sort of leadership credential. Never a bad thing, and obviously in a position that we were quite deficient in at centre back with, especially Mazouk getting injured just against I think it was Forest or Leeds. So a good signing in that sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's probably one of those ones that, like you said, leadership is going to be critical, particularly with this relegation scrap that we find ourselves in. The more players that you have around the club, like your Michael Dawsons, your David Milers, that have that experience, that aren't afraid to roll their sleeves up, can only be a good thing, particularly in the heart of our defence, knowing that that has been an area where we've had a lot of shortcomings since the beginning of the season. It's probably, well, almost certainly why we find ourselves where we do. So probably a very needed fit. And hopefully, fingers crossed, that he can be somewhat of a catalyst in fixing our defensive woes.
And he's only 25, which is another good thing. Good to get. He's not, a 21, 22-year-old very raw prospect or a, 32, 33-year-old veteran. He's right in that sort of, sweet spot where we'll actually get some pretty good years out of him if he is to stick around and be a long-term player for us. Um, the other aspect, of course, being it was for an undisclosed fee. Initially, there was talk that it was going to be a swap deal for one of our strikers, and I think, sort of thinking about it logically, Will Keane's been out with a 12-month injury. Hernandez is currently out injured. Uh, um, Campbell and Dicko have only just joined the club. It kind of only left Diamande as potentially the player that might have gone the other way. But as it is, we've kept all of our players. We've just paid a nominal fee, I would think. Don't quite know what the figure was actually ended up being, but sounds like it was a relatively good deal.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't come at a too large of a cost, and I think that given the fact that, as we touched on, the real need to have a player of that caliber, particularly when we haven't been struggling up the other side of the pitch too much with certainly the goal scoring form that Jarrod Bowen finds himself in, and despite Fraser Campbell having a bit of a dry patch at the moment, he's still chipped in a little bit. So I guess that Diamonde, as you said, would have most likely been the player that was offered up as a swap, which I think probably would have suited both clubs in that sense. And we wouldn't have been too frustrated to see Diamonde go, given the price tag that he came in and came to the club for, and the fact that he probably hasn't got the goal return or any real kind of credible runs under his belt, despite having scored the odd famous goal or two.
Well, yeah, speaking of Diamande, I guess he was our one of our only signings, I think, alongside Nick Powell 2 seasons ago when we were in the championship with Bruce, if I'm not mistaken, or was he no, was he a summer signing? I'm trying to remember now. He might have been
I
summer,
think
but he was out injured for most of the first half.
That's right, yeah,
Yeah.
and that almost was a false start in the sense that we were excited that we had that striker that was kind of very much needed at the time, and people were complaining about when we had the opposite problem. Couldn't score goals, but could certainly keep them out. And he came with a waft of expectation
Yeah,
and
crazy
never
scoring
really
record.
delivered. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Be very good. But I remember that he was signed on the proviso from Bruce that he did have quite the goal scoring record in Norway, I believe it was.
Yeah.
Whether that really adds up to anything or not, he never really delivered. And I think that whilst he's not the most hopeless of players up top for the club, he, as I said, he's never really stamped his kind of mark in that in one of those positions to warrant first team football every week.
Well, speaking of players coming in with very good goal scoring records, it's our other signing of the window, loan signing from Liverpool, young Harry Wilson, who's a record setter in a number of ways. He was the youngest ever Welsh senior player to be capped at 16 years, 207 days old, which also made him Liverpool's youngest ever international, which is a pretty incredible tag to have in your head. I think the next youngest for Wales was Gareth Bale, so that's the sort of company he's keeping with that record. And Liverpool recently do seem to have a pretty decent record with producing these sort of young players. So that bodes well for us in that sense. 10 goals in 12 appearances for the youth team so far this season, so very prolific. And he can play on either wing, which is really good. I think we sort of touched on him in our the last episode that he'll be a great sort of flexible option to have, whether it's Grosicki currently injured, whether he's playing on the left and then having Bowen freed up to play on his natural position on the right, or, when Grosicki and Bowen are both fit, to have Wilson on the bench to potentially bring on in either of those positions to kind of give us a bit more flexibility and a range of options in that sense. So he's a good young prospect. Give him a bit of game time and see how he develops.
Without a doubt, there's certainly a large amount of promise there. And I guess that with the form of Grosicki and knowing that he does sometimes tend to go missing, would be nice to have that coverage you mentioned, that if Grosicki does have an off day or isn't kind of firing in the sense that we require him to, then he's certainly a strong candidate and option that gives us that variety that we're not really that used to having in wide positions. I think I also read an interesting stat this morning that his grandfather, I believe it was, put £50 on him to become the next Wales international, or it
Oh,
might have
wow.
been just to play for Wales, and it had happened, and he obviously had a huge payout. So that was a fantastic little piece of trivia that I was
Yeah.
reading about today, and thought, obviously a little bit of character there.
Absolutely. And it's crazy when you think, I mean, there's two bit elements of this that give a bit of perspective is, first of all, it's crazy to think 12 months ago we're signing Lazar Markovic on loan from Liverpool, and
Mm.
a bit of perspective that no disrespect to Wilson, but the drop in quality between the two really sort of underlines um, our position in the football league now, and really sort of is a sobering reminder of just how far we've fallen in just 12 months. But on the more positive side, the silver lining is he's 20 years old, which is incredibly young. But when you put it in perspective, he's only 1 year younger than Jarrod Bowen, who is absolutely tearing up the league. And so that's really actually quite a strong positive for Bowen to see just how well he's doing at such a young age.
Without a doubt. And having those players of that age and that caliber in your squad can only be a good thing. I guess like you mentioned, the long-term contract that he signed with Liverpool is a fascinating one, and obviously shows the degree of trust and faith that they actually have in how highly they rate this player. So, look, whilst unproven, it certainly comes with all the plaudits that we're kind of hoping for as far as giving that X factor and that drive for extra goals. I think another one more random stat to add into the things. I think it was 12 months today that we beat Liverpool 2-0.
Wow. Yeah.
As you mentioned, that Lazar Markovic signing. So, if there's any indication of how far we've fallen, that game in itself is probably a stark reminder.
And I saw a tweet from Andy Robertson wishing Wilson all the best luck as he came here. I wonder if Andy might have got in his ear a little bit to sort of encourage him to come here on loan and sort of settle any nerves because, yeah, Andy's really obviously travelling quite well with Liverpool at the moment, and that's another one where you kind of look at and you think, geez, how do we get relegated when you've got Maguire excelling at Leicester, you've got Robertson excelling at Liverpool, and a couple of other decent players around the place now as well, and you just think there's so much quality that we had, and yeah, how quickly things can sort of fall apart.
But I guess the most heartbreaking aspect of that is usually you expect when you do lose players of that caliber, particularly for the fees that Maguire and Robertson in particular were signed on and the kind of return that we were able to get from that, you usually hope that translates into money that can be reinvested. And because of the very tiny and insignificant outlay that the Allams have kind of put back into the club, I think we find that the most difficult part to swallow about the whole transfer window itself.
Well, I was going to ask you that. I mean, there were a few players that we missed out on. Scott McKenna obviously being the most highly publicised from Aberdeen. We had 3 bids rejected for him in the end, maybe a couple more that weren't as widely publicised, but he seemed quite a quality young centre-back that we were after for a little while. There was the loan move for Rolando Aarons that fell through from Newcastle, although I have a feeling that Harry Wilson was essentially a backup option for that. It wasn't going to be that we're going to get both of those. As you say there, the amount of money that we had recouped in the summer, it does seem strange when you hear that the club doesn't have much money to spend, that we're on a tight budget, all that sort of thing. Obviously, there are reasons that we can accept that may be the case, but it's a bit hard to stomach and hard to swallow when you think, well, we do actually have quite a lot of money floating around somewhere. I don't think it's all being caught up in wages and paying off installments for previous transfers, things like that. I can't accept that, but I guess you would hope, if that's necessarily the case, that at least the debt to the owners is being paid down or something like that. But you've got to feel that there should have been a bit more action in the transfer window.
Let's not beat around the bush. I think it's nothing short of disgusting. The amount of money that has been put back into the club in this transfer window, and the constant beating around of Ehab Allam coming out and saying that he thinks that he's got every faith in the squad. It's absolute rubbish, and I think that kind of McKenna transfer or lack of is probably the thing that highlights it to me the most. A player who 12 months ago would have jumped at the opportunity to be on the Hull City books. In fact, it would have been one of the most positive career moves he could ever have made. Fast forward 12 months later, and we're offering bids short of £1 million that are getting rejected, and then going back to offer similar wage bids with just different pay structures, which to me is just abhorrent when you think about the money that, as we mentioned, that has been recouped. Let's not make any mistakes here. We're sitting in the bottom 3. If the club goes down, the value of the club goes down. Any assets that we do have are kind of still tied up on the books will most likely leave and search for greener pastures elsewhere. It's do or die. And the fact that the Allams have left the club in this predicament and not kind of gone in and made those transfers, your players like McKenna, who are strong and offer that kind of get out of jail free card of a solid defender who could really come in and add something to an extremely failing defence, and they've let a signing like that fall on deaf ears. I think it's abhorrent, and it's disgusting that the fans that put in such solid effort and trip around and try to remain positive are kind of being forced to beat the same drum when it doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up that the owners could allow the club to suffer like this. I get that they're bitter, and I get the fact that they're trying to regain a lot of the money and recoup it as they look for an owner. But if the club goes down, they'll see far less of it than they've ever imagined. So it's a perplexing situation we find ourselves in.
Yeah, and I've always found it difficult to understand. I think my logic was always when we got relegated that championship seasons was when everyone was sort of pulling in the same direction, because from the owner's point of view, it was a case of trying to get back to the Premier League as quickly as possible. Once they're, I can understand from their point of view, just sort of pocketing all of the Premier League money and not really adding to the squad. But certainly in the Championship, I would have thought it's always a case of, well, look, if we've got a good squad, if we spend, say, 10, 20 million pounds, retain all of the players that have come down with us, spend another 10, 15 million pounds, go straight back up, that I would have thought in the long run would be a profitable strategy rather than what they're doing this season, which is essentially just saying, well, we've sold these players for whatever it was, about 40, 50 million pounds, and we'll spend 15 million. So a net gain of 35 million pounds. Just doesn't seem to make sense at all. And you talk about McKenna there with a bit of, I think it was about 500,000 pounds. You think 2 years ago, Andy Robertson was getting bought for 2.5 million. And he was a very inexperienced, rough, young player. A very similar situation to McKenna. Probably not. Yeah, I would have said that McKenna would be worth as much as Robertson, really, when you think about it. And that's 2.5 million pounds. We're offering 600,000 for him. You would think we'd at least offer about a million, but it's not the case. Ehab, in an interview in the last few days, was saying, oh, it's tough to buy players in January because of the inflationary nature of the market at the moment, that everyone's holding out for that extra money that will come in the next transfer window, which I just think it's just another one of those really weird excuses from him, because you just sort of think, well, if that's the case, sure, you don't necessarily go out and buy players, but where's the new deals, decent wages for guys like Huddleston, Dawson, Hernandez, Maguire potentially, all those sorts of guys. Where's the money to retain those players? And then, yeah, we'll see those greater fees in the years to come. Or else, if you're going to sell Maguire, sell Robertson, sell these guys in the summer, where's some of that money? Just even like I'm saying, just 50% of it maybe getting reinvested on similar young players. So I can appreciate, yeah, we brought in Jackson Irvine and we brought in Dicko and we sort of and Terral, and we tried to pursue that strategy a little bit. But you've got to see in January that that's not necessarily working, that these guys aren't working out as a team. As individual players, they aren't bad players, but something's not clicking. We've tried changing the manager. That hasn't necessarily worked either. But you've got to make some sort of, whether we loan some of these guys out to clear them off the wage book, bring in some other guys, I don't know what the solution is. But it's just a very messy situation that we find ourselves in. And we talked in recent weeks about looking at the situation at Sunderland, and you think, well, geez, they've got someone like Jack Rodwell on the books, who didn't have a relegation clause. He's still on his £70,000 a week, and you think, well, that's such a mess. What an incompetently run club that they can let this situation occur. But really, ours isn't much better. Yeah, I think I read somewhere recently that I think Grosicki's our top wage earner, and he's on about 25,000 a week, which is a lot, but compared to Rodwell on 70,000, that's not that much. But you just think that somewhere down the line, we've not managed our squad at all well in terms of contracts, in terms of selling players at the right time, buying decent young players. We seem to just have this really sort of inexperienced scouting setup where it almost seems just like we joked about the fact that in the summer, Irvine scored against us, Dicko scored against us, and we've signed both of them. That was almost our recruitment strategy.
Well, the other side of things that I'd like to take it even further is a quick look up the table to see where Derby is situated at the moment. They've got Davies and Huddleston playing for them, with all reports, two players that were more than happy to stay if their contracts were negotiated earlier. We're talking about a much smoother price tag than even having to go out and kind of do that shopping list. I think Curtis Davies
I don't understand how the extra wages on a new contract would be worth so much less than going out paying a transfer fee and paying wages for a new signing.
That's right. And I think that if you look at the caliber of player in Curtis Davies, and no respect to the new signings or what we've currently got in our defence, but Curtis Davies is arguably our best defender out of all of those, and we let him walk out the door. And you can just see the kind of fruits of what he's done by sliding into a club like Derby. That's also not even discounting the fact that Livermore left on big money earlier than that. We've got Rob Snodgrass, who's playing for Villa well and truly in the top six under Bruce, and by all reports making a fist of it. These are some quality caliber championship signings that they've disappeared and slipped through the cracks. And with the big money that was laid off, particularly for Livermore and Snodgrass, we haven't seen any of that either. And look where they are now. Particularly Snodgrass, and we're probably going to find ourselves in a situation where we're going to watch multiple players who left our club last year find themselves in a promotion position in a brand new club straight after with a bounce back up rather. And I think that's probably the hardest part to stomach, looking at who we have on the books, how many players are off contract, and how much money we've recouped from the players who will most likely get promoted. It's a very, very bitter pill to swallow.
And even last night we saw Mohamed Diame scoring a goal for Newcastle, reminding us that it was only 18 months ago that he rejected a new contract with a Premier League team, as we were at that point, to instead sign for a recently relegated Newcastle side. So there's a lot of perspective to put in place about where the players are going and why they're choosing the moves that they're making. But it's not a good look for the club with the way things are at the moment.
Well, I think that it's very easy to see the common denominator. You look at how many managers have kind of cracked under the weight of the alum administration. They've obviously gone in there with shopping lists, requested players, and somewhere along the lines, those requests aren't being heard. And the kind of the frustration for both sides is that the fans as well not getting the signings, but also the managers themselves that kind of put forward their blueprint of how to get out of the division or how to survive the division. And all of a sudden, it sounds like the alums are like, yes, yes, yes. And then as soon as it comes time to front up, the kind of plans change. And all of a sudden, the managers are stuck in that position of not really knowing what way to go. And that's where the frustration becomes evident.
Well, the silver lining to the window was that we didn't end up selling any of our prized assets. So we'll talk about some of the near misses, perhaps, that we had in the window with 3 players that almost left or could have left. There's discussion, speculation that they might be on the way out, but we've retained their services. First one being Jarrod Bowen, I think obviously the most important one to keep. We discussed on a podcast a couple of months ago that I think it was Dan and myself talking about whether or not he would be a City player at the end of the January transfer window. I was actually tagged in something on Twitter where Bowen was calling out a supporter who had tweeted him saying that if he was still a City player at the start of February, he'd go out and eat some kangaroo bollocks. And Bowen was sort of saying, oh, well, good luck to you to find a couple of those to have a munch on. And I said something along the lines of that I'd be happy to help try and source them for him. But it does seem amongst supporters that it seemed quite unlikely that Bowen would still be with us come the end of the window. But that's the way it's turned out, which is great to see. He seems like a very switched on young guy. Perhaps, he's heeded the warning of Josh Tymon's move to Stoke, where grass isn't always necessarily greener. He might not be on the best contract terms at City at the moment, but he's getting regular game time. He's playing well. He's scoring goals in a championship team for the time being, and that perhaps this is the best place to be for him.
It certainly seems that way. I think that you've already touched on it, his work ethic and his desire. It's obvious that when he does score goals, the celebration kind of matches the effort, and he seems very happy to be playing where he is. He certainly seems to be getting the opportunities to score goals in as far as chances created go. So whilst he is, it's very, I think another one that you touched on, it's very strange thinking back 12 months that Jarrod Bowen was not on the radar at all for City fans. And if he was off the bench and had played a very limited amount of football. Fast forward 12 months later in the dire situation that we find ourselves in, to see him head and shoulders above the rest and up amongst the leading championship goal scorers, having a cracking season. So I think when we kind of look at the meteoric rise, so to speak, probably still does suit him. I do, however, fancy that in 6 months' time, regardless of whether we end up staying in the division or not, if he keeps this goal scoring form going as he has been and remains as prolific as he is, it'll be very, very hard to see City being able to hold on to him.
Yeah.
Because the suitors will be coming out of the out of the clouds to get a hold of him.
Yeah, I can't see us holding on to him, especially if we are relegated. If we manage to stay up, who knows? He might be willing to stay on for another season. I think that'll be the sort of make or break of it. I think similar to last season with Robertson and Maguire, who might have been willing to stay on if we'd stayed up, but that wasn't to be. Another player who might have left us last season and is still with us this season, and we had a loan offer in for him on deadline day, was Kamil Grosicki, who was offered the loan move to Derby, or Derby tried to get him on loan, and it was swiftly rejected by Adkins and the board. It's an interesting one because from all reports, he's a bit peeved that he wasn't given his move and he didn't play against Preston on the weekend. It's an odd one though, in the sense that as it was only a loan deal, I don't know why he necessarily would have been that keen to move to another championship club. If it was a Premier League club, I could understand him wanting to make the move, but unless he thought that, if he played well at Derby, they may well sign him in the summer, I'm not sure. But he's still a City player at the end of the window, and alongside Bowen, he's been one of our most attacking players this season and really important to us going forward.
I think it's an absolute minor miracle that Kamil Grosicki will still be a City player in February and the next time he returns from injury. I think that it's just amazing. Everything that I've seen from him, suggestions from him, despite putting in some pretty valid performances, he certainly does just consider himself that cut above the rest, and sometimes it is hard to argue with him in the way that he does turn games on his head. Or on their head rather. And I think that, as you just mentioned, the ticket to Derby on the loan deal, I think would have, in his mind, probably been his fast track back to the Premier League. Seeing where they're positioned on the league table at the moment and the football that they're playing, I think that he's probably just looked at that as the opportunity that if the loan deal was to take place and he performed in a very promising team, then that probably would have been the first rite of passage of Derby to make him their signing, and that would have been the free ticket back to the Premier League. Instead, he finds himself in a very frustrating league relegation scrap in a otherwise deteriorating club. So I think that it's probably a case of everyone trying to jump ship at the moment, given the nature of what's actually happening behind the scenes. But I think I speak for everyone in saying that we're very, very lucky to have him and stoked that he will be available for the last few months run in.
And unfortunately, talking about players being willing to jump ship, it seems that's extended even to the club captain, with Michael Dawson almost joining Nottingham Forest on deadline day. And this is probably the most interesting of the three in terms of how close it came to happening, because by all reports, Dawson was actually in Nottingham thinking it was pretty close to being finalised. I mean, there's two sides to this. I find is I'm a little bit peeved at Dawson for getting a bit stroppy that the move didn't go through, and apparently not making himself available for selection against Preston, which I think was pretty unprofessional from someone that's been in the game long enough to understand that deals don't always get done, especially when they come through that late. And also from Forest, I think if Forest really wanted to sign him, I don't know why they left it till deadline day and really sort of giving us no choice or no chance to replace him and bring in a replacement, really basically made it an impossibility. I know that apparently the Allams had signed off on the deal and then only reneged on that when they saw the reaction from fans at the Hall of Fame dinner. But even so, it seemed like a very strange deal to kind of come out of virtually nowhere at the end of the window, and for all parties to be pissed off now that it hasn't gone through. I think it was a bit unreasonable of Dawson to think it was going to get done at that late stage.
I feel like we're beating the same drum in everything that we say, because it always does just seem to boil back down to the poorly run Allen administration that we find ourselves under. I think that the character of a player of Michael Dawson's caliber is one that shouldn't be questioned. I think we've all kind of hurt when we've watched those relegation games and when we have gone down from the Premier League. And I don't think there's a more upset figure than Michael Dawson when a club goes down. He gives everything when he's on the pitch and always has done his whole career. And as City fans, we've become accustomed to that because Andy Dawson was no different. I think it's probably worth going back and looking at the long list of positive characters that these alums have actually cracked in the form of Bruce, in the form of Mike Phelan, Slutsky to a degree. Even Marco Silva was pretty quick to jump ship, although granted it probably was for very different reasons. I think that the deciding factor was Dawson wanting to make that move to Forest, be it a very late one, was the fact that they offered an extended contract and, from my understanding, had some kind of scope for a coaching gig afterwards. And I think that given the fact that the uncertainty around City at the moment and the fact that we were probably only going to offer him a very short contract, if one at all, it would have been a year tops, really left him in that situation where he probably sees himself wanting to play for another 2 years. And Nottingham Forest could offer it and City couldn't.
Well, interestingly, it sounds as if that there's already potentially a deal in place for him to move in the summer, which wouldn't surprise me. It is going to be interesting to see how the rest of the season pans out with him and what sort of involvement he has, what his attitude is on the pitch, all that sort of thing. I would hope that he can sort of shift his focus to just sort of putting everything in for the team, as I'm sure he will, and keeping us in the division, come what may in the summer. We'll see when we get there. But it was certainly the most interesting development on deadline day. And honestly, at one point, I thought he and Grosicki were gone.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that when you look at both the individual players' situation and their kind of needs and requests for wanting away for different reasons, I think that if we're honest with ourselves, it's quite valid. It seems to be the worst group to be playing under, or the worst kind of owners in world football at the moment to be playing under. So the players obviously want away. The coaching staff even seemed to be struggling, and there was probably the first signs of cracks in Nigel Atkins's post-match interview as well. And I think it's just a case of these guys can break anyone's neck now, given the amount of pressure that they've put on him. To see someone like Dawson, I think, probably speaks more volumes than what it does to see Grosicki want away. But it certainly is a stark reminder of the dilemma that we find ourselves in for the run in.
Yes, it's an interesting situation, and yeah, I mean, it was an interesting window on the whole. I think I just keep coming back to the positive that we haven't sold anyone, that we've still got all of our better players at the club, and that really, bringing in a new centre back is clearly going to help with reinforcements in an area that we were quite thin. Bringing in another creative winger is a good option going forward, so it can only help share the load with Bowen and Grosicki as well. Could we have done a bit more? I think we definitely could have brought in another centre back, probably another full back. I think having only really Ola Aina, Tamori, and Kingsley, who's been unfit for most of the season. I don't know when Odebajo is expected back. I think relying on him to any extent would be foolish. I think another fullback certainly would have helped. But on the whole, I can't be too upset with the window. I guess going into the window, my expectations were pretty low, and I sort of expected us to only do business on deadline day. So I'm not as upset or as frustrated as some potentially might be who might have expected more to get done. But what was your overall feel of it?
I guess the pessimistic side of me looks at the playing roster, and whilst you did touch on the fact that we probably are in a position where this window, instead of getting excited about new signings coming in, is more a reflection on who we've held on to. With that in mind, I think that it's probably mindful to remember that we are sitting in the bottom three, and it's because of the same playing group that we currently have on the books up until now, those same players that we've done ever so well to hold on to, that have kind of allowed us to, or contributed to us being in that position. So whilst there is positives in the fact that we have kept our big players, there is also very worrying signs that those players are maybe not equipped to roll up their sleeves and get this job done of surviving this kind of second straight relegation situation that we find ourselves in. I think that certainly in the whole, I think that the two new signings are promising, and they're certainly not want-away players. I think they will add to the squad, albeit I guess it's still up for debate, and certainly one that is unknown, but particularly given the age. But I think that it's certainly an underwhelming transfer window, and as you said, when we go back and look at what money should be available and the amount of money that has been recouped, to see this low level investment is more of a concern for me than offering any sort of real solid sign of hope.
Well, yeah, so it's been a bit of an underwhelming end to the transfer window, and it was an underwhelming result on the weekend against Preston, which we'll discuss in our regular podcast this Thursday night. So hopefully everyone can tune in for that one. But until then, we've had a good discussion about the transfer window. So thank you for joining me for that, Logan.
Yeah, not a problem.
Thank you everyone for listening in. Hopefully this has helped give you some understanding of the new signings that have come into the club, brought you up to date on all of the goings on around the club towards the end of the transfer window, and been quite insightful. So until next time, come on City. You've been listening to the official Hull City Australia podcast. For more discussion, join us on Facebook in the Hull City AFC Australian Supporters Group, or follow us on Twitter at Hull City AFC Oz. The music was created by Amber and Black.
City's on fire. We're going higher and higher. There's no turning back 'cause you're out.